Call the member for Melbourne.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. When you're handing down a budget, you make choices. You make choices about what kind of services it is that you think that the Australian people are legitimately entitled to expect. You make assumptions about what kind of quality of life it is that we here in a rich country all deserve. And then you say, how could we raise the money to pay for those services in a way that most people would think was fair? A budget is a statement of your beliefs and values. It says what matters to you, and it's an identification of who in Australia is deemed to be important and worth looking after. And one thing that is crystal clear from this budget, as it was from the last budget, is that this is a government that is prepared to support the big businesses and fossil fuel lobbies that put them there and to turn their backs on everyone else. This budget locks in $80 billion of cuts to schools and hospitals that the states are meant to provide. This budget says we would rather allow the likes of Gina Rinehart to keep getting tax breaks than to give state governments the money they need to ensure that every child has a good education and that everyone can go to a hospital whenever they get sick. And let's make no mistake that not only is that something that the coalition ideologically believes in, they're doing it because they are trying to push the states into a position where the states themselves will ask to increase the GST. So gutless is this government that they won't even come out and state publicly their real position, which is that they want to see the GST increased. They're instead blackmailing the states by cutting their funding and forcing them to do their dirty work for them. It's a coward's budget, and it continues the cowardice from the last budget. It also locks in the massive cuts to higher education and to universities that have been so roundly rejected by this parliament and so roundly rejected by the Australian people. The coalition, when they got elected, promised no cuts to education, and then they came out and said, we're going to cut funds to universities by 20%, and we're going to force people to graduate with debts the size of a small mortgage if they want to go to university. And people rejected it, and instead of learning the lesson, the government is coming back and locking it in with this budget. So this budget continues all of the mistakes of the last budget that they didn't tell the Australian people about and that the Australian people are rightly angry about. But worse than that, it takes the axe to the sectors of the economy in Australia that need support to grow. At some point, the rest of the world is going to tell us to stop digging. And unless we've thought in this country about what life after the mining boom looks like, we will wake up in 15, 20 years' time to find that we are a hollowed-out, uneducated quarry. We need now to be getting behind the industries that will sustain us when the rest of the world stops digging. But all this budget can do is continue the dig it up, chop it down, ship it off mentality that is going to sell this country short in the 21st century. Because what are we going to be able to do in our region and in the world to sustain ourselves in the 21st century? We can't compete with China and India on wages, and nor should we try to. They're very different countries with, in many respects, in many places, much lower standard of living, much lower support being given to people, much lower protection for people when they go to work to ensure that they come home safe. So we're not going to be able to compete with them on wages. We're not going to be able to do that. At some point, digging things up and selling them is going to deliver less money than it does at the moment, or it has in the past. So what are we going to do? We are going to stand tall in the 21st century if we invest in our population, and that means investing in education, investing in innovation, investing in science and investing in research. At the moment, under this government, under the Abbott government, we are spending this year less on science, research and development than at any time since they started keeping records. Since they started keeping records in the late 70s, spending on science, research and development is now at its lowest, at 30-year lows. Exactly the sectors that we should be boosting are now being cut. And then they're continued in this budget, when we should be increasing spending on science, increasing spending on education. The government cuts $300 million from the Sustainable Research Excellence Fund. That's the money that goes to support the people who are doing the research. It keeps the lights on and the buildings open and provides some of the equipment for the people who are doing the research. Cut this money and you are going to find scientists and researchers having to do more of their own paperwork, being able to have less access to their offices and less access to their equipment, and that means less research being done. If you want scientists cleaning test tubes, then pass this government's budget. But if instead you want to support the people who support the researchers, the people who work in the offices in universities and research institutes, you increase the funding to them. But instead this government has cut it. It'll also come as no surprise that the Treasurer didn't mention climate change once in his speech. Didn't mention it once. Apparently it doesn't exist. While other countries understand that it is one of the most fundamental economic challenges facing them, and where we are put on notice that unless we get global warming under control, you can expect at the end of the century a 92% decline in productivity in the Murray-Darling Basin, and more money having to be spent dealing with the heat waves and bushfires that we know will come. Unless you want to do that, you have to get global warming under control. But this government doesn't even mention it. And they cut funding that is to go to climate measures from $1.35 billion in 2014-15 to $700 million in 2015-16 and then down to $500 million in 16-17. That's this government's head-in-the-sand approach to climate change. And I know that in the Energy White Paper they said, oh, well, maybe we can keep burning fossil fuels and there's other applications for it, like carbonated beverages. To be serious, the Energy White Paper's solution to climate change is to burn more coal and drink more lemonade. That is this government's approach to setting Australia up for the 21st century where we should be growing the clean economy. Instead, they're going the other way. And they're not only selling out our future, they're selling out people now, and especially people who most need support. And key amongst those are parents, mostly mums, who, after spending time in the workforce, take time out to have a baby, need a decent amount of time to bond with their young child and then maintain an ongoing connection to the workforce. And what does this government do? This government comes along and says, the ceiling that's in play, the scheme that's in place that was always intended to be a floor, not a ceiling, a minimum standard of 18 weeks at the minimum wage that you could then go and bargain above with your employer, we're going to cut that. We're going to cut that. We're not going to ask Gina Rinehart to pay a bit more. We're not going to ask the big four banks that are making world-leading profits to contribute a little bit more to the budget task, as they like to call it. We are going to ask mums of newborns. We're going to ask them to have less money in their pocket and less time at home out of the workplace so that we don't have to go and stand up to the big end of town. Now, when you look at the fact that 8 out of 10 of the top hardest hit electorates by this PPL change are in non-government electorates, you understand what's going on. The true colours of this government are shining through. The Prime Minister feigned feminism in order to get elected, but now that that's out of the way, the brutal chauvinism of this government is shining through, and the attack on working women continues in this budget. The attack on young people continues in this budget as well. The government says, if you haven't got a job, never mind the fact that there's 14% almost youth unemployment, never mind the fact that in some regional areas youth unemployment is above 25% and the jobs just aren't there. If you can't find a job that's not there and you're young, we're going to make you go a month without any money at all. Without any money at all. What does the Prime Minister expect someone to do when they are young, looking for their first job, and they cannot find it because youth unemployment is growing to a point where it hasn't come back into line to where it was before the GFC, where the jobs just aren't there? Why are you punishing a person by saying you now have no income at all? And more importantly, what do you expect someone to do? If they can't find a job and they haven't got any money, what do you expect them to do to survive? I am yet to hear an answer from the government about this, and we know what will happen. Those of us who pay attention and who work with those people on the front line in our community services, in our homelessness services, in our youth services, they know people will be homeless. People will find themselves doing things that they never thought they had to do just to get enough money to buy food. And this government says, in this budget, which is all about a statement of principles, we don't care. This budget, they say it's a have-a-go budget. It's a budget that has a go at young people. It's a budget that has a go at working women. And it's a budget that has a go at the arts, with not only hundreds of millions of dollars being cut, but the Attorney-General, George Brandis, deciding that he is going to aggregate everything into his own personal fiefdom and decide what kind of arts is acceptable in this country and what's not. But it has a go at aid as well. Australian aid is crucial for lifting people out of poverty around the world. And if you think it's a good idea to lift people out of poverty, then you've got to be prepared to put your money where your mouth is. If we look at other countries, and countries that are not the kind of democracies yet that we would hope for, but if we actually believe it's important to improve people's standards of living, then as a wealthy country, you spend a bit of money to assist them to increase their standard of living and to lift themselves out of poverty. And that's what Australian aid is for. And this budget continues the swinging cuts to Australian aid. And what's worse, they've targeted them. If you are an African country, expect on average a 70% cut to your aid budget. The cynical might say Australia increased its funding to aid while the African countries' votes for who was going to get on the UN Security Council was up in question, but now that Australia's got its place, we just turned around to Africa and said, I'm all right, Jack, I don't care. We've got our position, thanks for your votes, and now we're going to cut your aid by 70%. Just appalling. But critically, from the perspective of the government's credibility, this is a budget that is built on a lie. Because day after day, the Prime Minister and the Treasurer and all the coalition MPs come into this place and say, we're about small government. We're about lower taxes. You'll always get lower taxes under us. We're about removing taxes. And yet, when you look at the Treasurer's boast that there's now a credible path to surplus, and you look up the back of budget paper number 1, what do you find? What you find is this. You find that tax at the moment, as a proportion of our GDP, is 21.9%. Which way is it going under this government? Next year, it's going to go to 22.3%. Year after that, 22.7%. Then 23%, then 23.4%. So 1.5% tax increase as a percentage of GDP, that's the so-called credible path to surplus. Now, as a member of the Greens, I am glad we are having a debate about raising the share of revenue in this country, because it is a much better solution than taking the axe to health and education or asking people to pay more to go and see the doctor. But I will not take the sanctimony from the government, whose own budget papers said we are on track to increase tax to GDP so that tax is 23.4%, when under Whitlam it was 20.3%. This government is increasing the share of the tax take in this country to 3% higher than it was under Gough Whitlam. So I will not take the sanctimony from this government about the need for cuts to health and cuts to education. There is enough money there, and we could have more. We could have more if we had the courage to raise tax to the same level as under that arch-Marxist John Howard, former Prime Minister John Howard. If we had revenue at the same level as under John Howard, there'd be an extra $30 billion a year to ensure that everyone can go to school, everyone can get a free education, that there's hospitals available for everyone else. If we just did what John Howard did and raised tax to that amount, which this budget is probably on track to do, and had the courage to say it's time to stop subsidising Gina Rinehart and her like so they can buy cheap fuel. It's time to ask the big banks who are making world-leading record profit just to chip in a little bit more. It's time to reform our super system so people don't use it as a tax haven and a tax dodge, but instead it's there to support people in retirement. If we shut down the detention centres and instead process people in the community, which will be much, much cheaper, then there will be enough money to make sure everyone in this country has a roof over their head, everyone can go to the school or university that they want to and it's publicly funded and it will give them a good education, and no one is ever in trouble when they get sick and we don't take the axe to the people who can least defend themselves.
I thank the